Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Always glad to have with us on our live line, calling in from St. Bonaventure this morning, Alfred University, and I guess also St. Bonaventure employee Dr. Gary Auster. Dr. Auster, thanks for calling in.
Good morning, Brian. I'm lucky to be here. I missed as I'm coming to work this morning, I missed a deer by, I think, probably no more than maybe 2 or 3 feet. It was about as close as I've come to that kind of an accident.
Sure thing. How did you do that? Did you swerve out of the way, or did it jump? What happened?
I swerved a little bit, and it's a good thing I swerved. If I hadn't swerved, I would have hit the thing.
I was going to a Hartsville meeting once, and all of a sudden there were like 4 or 5 deer right out in the road. And I swerved at, this is on gravelly dirt type road, and stopped just in time.
Well, I'm pretty careful when it comes to deer. I was on Route 244 between Alfred and Belmont. There are a lot of deer on that road, so I tend to go a little bit slow. I was looking off to the right, thinking that's where the deer would likely be, if there were deer at all, and this guy came, a big buck, from the left. I was, as I say, we're lucky to be talking right now.
Yeah, I hear you. Our former morning man, Gary Gray, was not so lucky one morning coming up Ashbaugh. He hit one, and the thing got up and walked away, Gary said, but yeah, his car was not in such great shape. We're talking with Dr. Gary Auster. Wanted to start out with the U.S. Embassy situation over in Jerusalem, Israel. First question, Dr. Auster, why did they open the embassy on the day that they did, Sunday, May 13th?
Well, it was the Israeli Independence Day, just like our July 4th. It is the 70th anniversary of Israeli independence, so they had scheduled that for some time in advance. And the following day, and let me offer, if I may, just a little bit of historical perspective here, because in the Middle East you cannot escape history. The Israeli independence goes back to 1948. And what happened the day after Israeli independence was that within 24 hours of independence, 5 Arab countries declared war on Israel. Those countries included Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and also Iraq. So as that war began, the Jews in Israel forced out many of their Arab of the Arab citizens of what was going to become Israel, and by the same token, those Arab countries also encouraged the Arab residents of what would become Israel, then Palestine, to leave. They did so for political reasons. It was a mess, and ultimately about 300,000 to 400,000 people left. A number had already left because of a civil war in that area earlier. And as a result of that, the descendants of those folks who were either forced out or who left voluntarily have argued that they have a right to return. That's what that term means, that the descendants have a right to return to Israel itself. Except that today, those descendants are not 300,000 to 400,000, a total number of probably in the neighborhood of between 2 and 3 million. Well, should they return to Israel, it would essentially mean that Israel is no longer a Jewish state. And consequently, there are religious issues here, there are political issues here, there are economic issues here, all of which continue to roil the current situation. The Arabs call it the Nakba.
Yeah, that was my next question, the Palestinians' Nakba Day. What's that?
It means they call the term means in English catastrophe. From their perspective, in other words, as they left, that was the catastrophe, that they were forced out to a certain extent, left to a certain extent voluntarily, but they view that as a catastrophe, and that remains very much an issue. In other words, they are demanding that they have the right to return to their old homes. The Israelis, of course, would view that as a catastrophe of their own. And so there's going to be very, very little areas of agreement here. I mean, it's possible. It is possible that the Israelis might, in some kind of a settlement over this issue, allow some of the descendants to return, but they're certainly not going to allow 2 to 3 million to return. And so that remains, as I say, very much an issue. Now, the other question, I suppose, that one might pose here is, why did the Trump administration move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? Jerusalem, after all, is the capital of Israel, has been the capital of Israel ever since 1948. Although it is the capital, and in a rather unusual situation, the U.S. Embassy, has not been placed in Jerusalem, and the embassies of a few other countries that were in Jerusalem departed right around 1970 or so. They moved their embassies to Tel Aviv, and that's where the situation has been, sitting, since that time. For Trump to make the change in 2018 was bound, almost inevitably, to stir up anger within the Palestinian community. And that, of course, we see that anger expressed especially in Gaza, where, if I'm not mistaken, the day before yesterday, about 58 people were killed. Prior to that, there were approximately 50 others who were killed. And so, what you have is an environment which is characterized by violence, and I don't know at what point that violence is going to end.
Can I read a editorial from an Israeli reporter, Gary?
Sure.
Whether one accepts the Palestinian narrative of hungry masses demonstrating for dignity, or the Israeli version of a cynical exploitation of human lives as the cover for homicidal intent, there is no doubt that the scores of dead and many hundreds of wounded on the Gaza border spoiled Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump's extravaganza yesterday. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a relatively good way of looking at the whole thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is that for many Gaza is one of the most highly populated little areas in the entire world. It's characterized by high unemployment. If I'm not mistaken, unemployment ranges anywhere, depending on which group you're talking about, from maybe 40% to 70%. That unemployment has been exacerbated by an Israeli boycott, not an Israeli boycott, but essentially an embargo of goods from Gaza, an embargo also of goods into Gaza. So the economic situation there is pretty extreme. By the same token, the reason why the Israelis have imposed those kinds of embargoes is because they fear that Gaza will ultimately be utilized as a kind of base for military action against Israel. And therefore, it's a situation that's just not going to easily resolve itself. Hamas is the governing organization in Gaza. Hamas is a terrorist organization from the Israeli perspective. Hamas has attacked Israel. Hamas, what shall I call them? I guess Hamas terrorists have committed acts of terrorism, suicide bombings, and so forth in Israel itself. And so the Israelis are not likely to be very kindly to Hamas. On the other hand, there is real, genuine economic and political grief in Gaza, and that's not going to go away. And by, I think, resituating the embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem was bound almost inevitably to lead to an explosion. Much of this had been predicted, and yet the Trump administration, I think, was, for political reasons at home, more so than for reasons having to do with Israeli politics, has stepped into the middle of a firestorm. And that firestorm, as they say, is not likely to abate. We often say, as historians, that there are certain inflection points. And by an inflection point, we mean that, tomorrow is going to be very, very different from today. That is to say, things are really going to change. And that may be a product of what is happening right now, because the Palestinians are claiming, of course, that what the Israelis are doing represents a massacre. It's a violation of national law. From the Israeli perspective, of course, they're simply defending their borders in much the same way that, Trump argues that we have to defend our borders. It's a mess.
Did you notice, Dr. Ostrower, the choice of ministers that President Trump picked to, I guess, give an invocation blessing or something at the U.S. Embassy for the opening of Israel? The choice of ministers has been very much criticized.
Well, the two key ministers were Robert Jeffries and John Hagee. Jeffries is a Dallas pastor.
He's the one that's being very much criticized.
For good reason. I mean, he's denigrated Jews. He has denigrated Mormons. As a matter of fact, he's denigrated Muslims. He's denigrated virtually every religious group, and that's not a very. I mean, I was really kind of shocked to know that, in light of what he said about Jews, arguing among other things that Jews cannot ascend to heaven or whatnot, I was shocked that he was asked to do one of the benedictions over there. Mitt Romney has strongly criticized his presence from a Mormon perspective. John Hagee, who's a megachurch televangelist, also from Texas, I believe, has claimed that Hitler was descended from, quote, half-breed Jews. He said that, this is all part of God's plan to return Jews to Israel. Well, I mean, maybe there are people who really believe that, but it's incendiary. It's really insulting to Jews. It's insulting to Muslims. It's insulting to almost everyone except members of his own church. Why Trump would do this is not mysterious. It has everything to do with Trump's political base at home. And that's why I said before that I think that much of what's happened here in respect to the shift of the embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem has more to do with American domestic politics than it has to do with Israeli politics.
We're talking live with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Going to take a quick break, check the weather, then we'll be back, and we'll talk about China when we get back.
The DJ you should hire listens to you about the kind of party or reception you'd like to have, pronounces your name right, plays the music you request, not the songs he feels like hearing. The DJ you should hire works out the songs ahead of time with you. Sean Stewart, DJ Truth, for all occasions, weddings, dances, graduations, anniversaries, and parties. 661-7658. 661-7658. 661-7658 for Sean Stewart, DJ Truth.
Saying good morning now to meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Hey, how you doing today?
Hey, not too bad, Brian. Looks like it could be a busy day for some of us. We've got a cold front headed our way that may actually have some showers and thunderstorms associated with it. We've already had one batch of rainfall move across the state, some moving through right now and headed off to the east, but there's more back to the west, eastern Ontario, all the way out to Michigan. So we're going to stay unsettled throughout the day. We'll call for showers and thunderstorms with temperatures near 70. Sun came up this morning at 5:48. It'll set at 8:25 this evening. Now tonight behind the front, it should turn partly cloudy. Lows will drop down to about 50. We'll see a mixture of clouds and sunshine develop during the day tomorrow. Temperatures will be up to 75 to 80. Tomorrow night, partly cloudy. Lows will drop down to about 55. The outlook for Thursday, partial sunshine, highs 75 to 80, and looks like maybe a little bit more in the way of rain headed our way for Friday afternoon, Brian.
And we have Dr. Gary Ostrower, the longtime Alfred University history professor, on the phone this morning. Switching over to the topic of China and ZTE. I'm reading from New York Magazine right now. And they have a tweet from Donald Trump. It says, quote, ZTE, the large Chinese phone company, buys a big percentage of individual parts from U.S. company. This is also reflective of the larger trade deal we are negotiating with China and my personal relationship with the president there. And that ends the Trump tweet. Now, New York Magazine points out something interesting. Quote, in exchange for backing off of ZTE, U.S. officials are reportedly pushing Beijing to let a proposed acquisition of NXP semiconductors move forward. And it says they also want China to relax tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. And your thoughts, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, the ZTE situation is just mysterious. I mean, I guess maybe a little part of Donald Trump is mysterious. Trump had run for president to make America great again. Trump had run on the basis that we were going to impose tariffs on Chinese goods from anywhere from 25 to 40%. Trump had run for president on the, using the argument that we have to create new jobs in the United States. Well, ZTE is a Chinese firm. It's a communications firm. They make communications equipment. And Trump said just this past week that the United States has to back off the issue of tariffs on ZTE goods because we don't want to contribute to unemployment in China. Okay, in China, not in the United States, in China. So, I mean, I think that many of Trump's supporters are willing to give him a pass, regardless of what he says. But the fact of the matter is that his position on ZTE is exactly contrary, 180 degrees contrary to what he had said during his campaign. Now, look, I don't know the details about where ZTE, gets its parts. Most of its parts, I would guess, are manufactured in China, just like most of everything these days is manufactured in China. But for Trump to now start, arguing that, our concern really are jobs in China, not in the United States, just doesn't make much sense at all from my perspective. We'll hear more about this. I can imagine how the Democrats are going to use this in some of the campaign in 2018, and especially, of course, in 2020 should Trump run for re-election. But he's going to have to explain that away. And I thought, by the way, that during the press briefing in the White House just yesterday, when the assistant press secretary was asked about this question, he seemed to be at a loss as to how to explain it, basically arguing that, I guess, I just don't know enough about this, you'll have to ask others, is what he says. Well, the fact of the matter is that he's the press spokesman, and while Trump today is coming out with a statement that, more or less that you just read, the fact of the matter is that, it just kind of points up how very complex issues are. And one other point I should make, and that has to do with North Korea. Trump is going to be meeting the North Korean president, Kim, in about a month or so. If there is going to be any agreement between the U.S. and the North Koreans on the issue of nuclear weapons, it's going to have the endorsement of the Chinese. It's going to have the support of the Chinese. Trump understands that. Kim understands that. I think that virtually all experts in this field understand it. And that may have a lot to do with why Trump is backing off his campaign promises vis-a-vis tariffs on Chinese goods.
I'm on New York Magazine, the website now, Dr. Ostrower, and reading off it, what it basically says is that the chemistry, the personal chemistry between Trump and Kim Jong-un at the upcoming June meeting that you just talked about will only go so far in accomplishing either side's goals. What will come afterwards will be a far heavier lift, it says. And it goes on to say that John Bolton just laid out a case for why the Iranian nuclear agreement from Obama was a non-starter, and Bolton had previously proposed that North Korea follow the Libyan model for giving up their weapons. Your thoughts on what Bolton says?
Well, the Libyan model means this. The Libyans gave up their nuclear weapons not after a long series of negotiations, but rather quickly. And that's what Bolton is saying he wants with North Korea. An agreement, in other words, where the North Koreans sit down, and the following day, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little bit, that the North Koreans agree to give up their nuclear weapons. That's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the North Koreans remember something else about the Libyan model, namely that Libya gave up its nuclear weapons, and within a relatively short time, the Libyan dictator was dead. That's not going to happen in North Korea. The North Koreans are going to exact a price from the U.S., which is one of the reasons why I'm not even sure this agreement is ever going to materialize. What will the North Koreans, if this is a genuine negotiation, and Trump claims that he's a great negotiator, well, what's the negotiation about? Will the North Koreans will give up their nuclear weapons, or maybe some of their nuclear weapons, or maybe some of their nuclear weapons over the course of 10 or 20 years? In return for what? The return may be that the United States is going to have to remove all of its troops from South Korea, or some of its troops from South Korea. The United States is going to have to open up its markets to North Korea. Then the United States is going to have to make North Korea into an economic powerhouse, just as South Korea has become an economic powerhouse. We don't know what the terms are going to be. We have no clue right now as to what these terms are likely to be. And therefore, I think that we're going to have to be very, very patient, just like we're going to have to be patient with something like the Mueller investigation of the Russian ties to the White House.
We've been talking live with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning on the Newsmaker on AM 1480 WLEA. Down to the last couple of minutes, Dr. Auster, was there anything I did not bring up that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, there was an article in the New York Times today this morning, okay, so anyone can get it by going to nytimes.com. And I found it kind of fascinating, something that I never knew before, and I suspect that most listeners to this program have never known before. And it has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with geology. It has to do with the fact that there are, according to the New York Times, 169 potentially active volcanoes in the United States. And the reason why we're, kind of thinking along these lines is that most of us, I think, have seen some of the TV shots of what's happening in Hawaii right now with Kilauea. Hawaii, after all of Hawaii, all of the Hawaiian Islands are essentially volcanic. Well, it turns out that there are 50 potentially active volcanoes in Alaska, including one called Mount Cleveland, which is already showing seismic activity and which we might expect is going to, blow sometime over the next maybe 10 to 30 years or so. There are 80,000 planes a year that fly over Alaska. And if some of those planes fly into an area that is characterized by a lot of volcanic dust, it can be disastrous, so that air travel may very well be disrupted. In the Northwest, Mount Rainier, which is one of the tallest peaks in the United States, Mount St. Helens, which blew back in 1980, Mount Shasta in California, the largest peak in California, Mount Hood. Mount Whitney, I guess, is the largest, but Mount Shasta, I think, is the second largest peak in California. Mount Hood in Oregon. These are all volcanic mountains, and all of them are potentially active. Is it likely that we're going to see most of these volcanoes erupting? The answer is no, not now. Over the course of how many years? Hundreds of years, thousands of years. But I found it very, very interesting to realize how much potential volcanic activity there could be, and also how much historically there has been as we go back a few thousand years. So, keep your sights on volcanoes, folks.
Dr. Auster, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
According to a new study by the travel industry, Americans got 17 vacation days last year on average.